The Israel-Palestine conflict has been one of the most brutal wars in history, with riots, bombings, and military action on both sides. There have been more deaths in this war than many other wars like it, and it is also one of the longest wars in modern history, and is still ongoing. For years, the governments of both Israel and Palestine did not want to compromise, and used military action instead to settle the dispute. The Oslo Accords set about to change that, and gave a peaceful solution instead. But what was this agreement? And how did it come to be in the first place? The Oslo Accords were a landmark peace process based on secret talks between January and September 1993 in the countries of Israel and Palestine. This treaty attempted and succeeded to reach many goals, including helping begin diplomatic conversation between Israel and Palestine, putting a temporary halt to the conflict and stopping bloodshed, thus saving many lives. And lastly, setting an example for future conflicts on how situations like these can and should be handled diplomatically in the pursuit of world peace. But before we can go into how and what the Oslo Accords accomplished, we must first understand a background on what the Israel-Palestine conflict was. It all started in May 1948, when Israel and Palestine split into two nations because of a severe cultural divide. These cultures were the native Arabian Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis. Originally, there was only one culture of the Arabian Palestinians, but after the events of a Jewish genocide in World War II, named the Holocaust, many Jews migrated to their religious homeland of Jerusalem, which was in Palestine at the time. This, among other factors, caused a swell in Jewish population of Palestine, and the rise of many cultural differences occurring in the country. This eventually all came to a head with a civil war in Palestine, which caused the countries to split into the new states. Although this was the turning point of the conflict, most of the general unrest came earlier, when the newly formed UN had decided how they wanted to split the land. This topic is a fascinating piece of history, but not as relevant to our topic of the Oslo Accords, so we will not be covering it in this video. Now to return to the topic at hand. The first major event of this new conflict was the Arab-Israeli War in 1948. This was a war between the new state of Israel and a large amount of Arab countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and of course, Palestine. This war surprisingly ended with an Israeli victory in just 1 year, with a total of just 15,000 casualties. This war showed the world that Israel was a military force to be reckoned with. As a result of this war, Israel now controlled more Palestinian land than they would have in the UN proposal. It also resulted in Jordan's control of the West Bank and Jerusalem, while Egypt controlled the largely fought over Gaza Strip. This caused anger in Israel, as they could not win the most sought-over land. This war was followed by many more attacks on Israel by Arabian nations, namely by Jordan and Egypt, throughout most of the 1950s, with similar actions from Israel as well, in retaliation. This type of fighting continued until 1967, where the whole conflict escalated up to another war between the countries that lasted only 6 days. This war was unsurprisingly named the Six-Day War for this reason. The war ended in another Israel victory. They gained a large amount of territory in both Palestine and in the areas surrounding it, making the map look more like this after the war. You can see that they now control all of the lands gained by Jordan and Israel in the previous war, as well as a lot more in the south. Following this, Israel started to make illegal settlements in Palestinian territory, but they were not punished since the Israelis did not consider Palestine to be a real state. Then, in the late 1980s, Palestinians launched the first Intifada, which included boycotts of Israeli products and refusing to pay Israeli taxes in protest against the Israeli claim over the land. This provoked an Israeli response of many actions, including violence and arrest in most circumstances. The First Intifada also caused the founding of Hamas, a Palestinian group who decided to take things into their own hands. They launched the first suicide bombing against Israel in 1993. Today, this organization still exists and is known as a terrorist group. But, back then, Hamas was known for all of the good things it did for the Palestinians, such as making new schools, hospitals, and mosques in Gaza. Now, to bring us back to how this is relevant to the Oslo Accords, the First Intifada is actually the cause of peace talks between the two countries, which will become our topic today of the Oslo Accords. The objective of the Oslo Accords was very modest. It was just to start the communication between the two countries and to resolve some of the land disputes that were created. The reason that they are called the Oslo Accords is because the plan itself was made by officials from Oslo, and the talks were mediated by them. Mona Juul being the main individual to do these jobs. But unlike her and most of her officials, the people still had great resentment against the opposing side. So, the negotiations had a lack of support from both sides, as the people were dead against compromising anything. This forced the talks to be held in secret, so the people could not stop them. The Norwegians even made a fake statement that they were going to do a report on the living conditions in Palestine, just so that they could be there to help mediate the accords. Eventually, though, a compromise was reached, as Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and the PLO leader Yasser Arafat both were willing to give up larger portions of land than ever before in hopes of peace. But now the countries faced an issue, as they knew the people would not approve of this decision to peace. So, they asked the United States of America for aid implementing the treaty. This led to the most popular image of the topic of the country's leaders shaking hands in front of President Clinton. Now that we have finished understanding what the Oslo Accords were, we can now start to analyze what its impact was. We can start by seeing how it aided relationships between the two countries. After the signing of the treaty, as part of the Israel-PLO letters of recognition, both countries had recognized that the other exists, which is a big deal because most of the unjust actions in the war were justified by the other's non-existence. The Oslo Accords also started a communication system between the two countries, as well as a telephone line for emergency communications. The Oslo Accords helped in other ways as well. In it, the Gaza-Jericho Agreement stopped both states from committing acts of terrorism, and it saw a removal of Israeli troops from the Gaza Strip and Jericho. Sadly, the withdrawal of troops was not permanent, but lasted only a short 5 years. But in this time, we can calculate that in time periods around then, about 400 people died in the conflict yearly. So, since this was 5 years long, it saved about 2,000 lives, which is a big accomplishment that the Oslo Accords did not even aim to achieve. But arguably more important than some of the short-term accomplishments are some of the effects it has had on other conflicts. The Oslo Accords showed the world that even some of the world's toughest and most seemingly unsolvable problems can have peaceful endings. For example, the UN still uses the treaties today to try and see what steps they should take in difficult conditions and conflicts when aiming for peace. And even though the Oslo Accords could not permanently stop the Israeli-Palestine conflict, it stands as a symbol to these countries that it is possible for the two countries that they can one day communicate and find peace.